The Arizona Territory, 1882. A land of scorching sun and sudden violence where a single act of kindness could get you killed. For the widow Helena Vaughan, giving a piece of bread to a starving Apache was a simple act of humanity. But in the town of Salvation's Point, it was a death sentence. An outlaw named Troy Kingsley made her a public spectacle, mocking her, shaming her, marking her as his next victim. He thought he'd broken her. He was wrong. He never imagined the Apache would remember. He never imagined the warrior would return. And he never ever imagined he'd come back, not for revenge, but for a bride. The dust of Salvation's Point was a living thing. It coated every surface in a fine, rust-colored film, worked its way into the seams of your clothes, and created a perpetual grit between your teeth. For Helena Vaughan, it was the taste of survival. From the window of her small but tidy establishment, Vaughan's Provisions and Bakery, she watched the town breathe its dusty breath. It was a hard place, carved out of the unforgiving Arizona landscape, populated by men and women whose faces were maps of hardship, greed, and fleeting hope. Helena had been here for 3 years, 2 with her husband Thomas, and 1 alone. Thomas had seen promise in this place, a chance to build something real. He'd bought the lot with the only reliable well for a mile in any direction, a fact that made him both respected and envied. Then the fever took him swift and merciless, leaving Helena with the store, the well, and a loneliness as vast as the desert sky. She was a handsome woman, not in a delicate, fragile way, but with a strength that shone from her clear grey eyes. Her dark hair was usually pinned in a tight, practical bun, and her hands, though often dusted with flour, were capable and strong. She ran the store with a quiet efficiency that earned the town's grudging respect. She was fair, she was honest, and she kept to herself. In a place like Salvation's Point, that was the safest way to be. The afternoon sun was a hammer blow driving most sensible folk into the shade. The only significant presence on the street was Troy Kingsley and his 2 cronies, a pair of greasy, sycophantic louts named Cletus and Ike. Troy Kingsley was the town's resident malignancy. He was a big man running to fat, but with the muscle of a bull beneath it. His face was a pock-marked landscape of arrogance, and his small, piggish eyes missed nothing, especially not weakness. He'd made a small fortune in some nefarious way, land grabs, cattle rustling. No one dared ask too closely. And now he acted as if he owned Salvation's Point. In many ways he did. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine seemed to have been misplaced somewhere back in Missouri, mostly stayed out of Kingsley's way. As long as Kingsley didn't shoot anyone in broad daylight without a flimsy excuse, the law was content to look the other way. Troy and his boys were lounging outside the saloon, their laughter a harsh, grating sound that set Helena's teeth on edge. Troy's attention was, as it often was, fixed on her store. He wanted her land. He wanted her well. He'd made several offers, each one more insulting than the last, his polite veneer barely concealing the threat beneath. "A woman alone can't manage a place like this," he'd say, a leering smile playing on his thick lips. "You need a man to look after you, Helena." Helena had refused him every time, her voice low and steady, her gaze unwavering. His refusals only seemed to fuel his obsession. It was then that she saw him. He emerged from the shimmering heat haze at the edge of town, a spectre of dust and bones. He was Apache, that much was clear from the high cheekbones, the long, unbound black hair, and the simple leather breechcloth he wore. But he was a shadow of a warrior. His ribs, stood out like the rungs of a ladder. His skin was stretched taut over his face, and he moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle that spoke of days, perhaps weeks, without food. He stumbled, catching himself against a hitching post, his eyes scanning the street with a desperation that clawed at Helena's heart. The town saw him too. Doors quietly closed. Windows were shuttered. An Apache in town was trouble. A starving Apache was a vulture, and no one wanted to be the carcass it landed on. They were seen as ghosts, savages less than human. The warrior's gaze fell upon the saloon, then drifted, finally settling on Helena's bakery. On the window ledge, a few loaves of day-old bread were cooling, set out for the less fortunate prospectors who couldn't afford the fresh loaves inside. He stared at the bread with an intensity that was primal. He took a hesitant step toward it, then another. Helena's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the rules. She knew the risks. Helping him would be seen as a betrayal. But she also saw a human being dying on his feet. Her Thomas had always said, "Kindness costs nothing, Helena, but withholding it can cost you your soul." She made her decision. Wiping her hands on her apron, she took one of the loaves, not a day-old one, but a fresh warm one from the morning's baking, and a canteen of fresh cool water from her well. She pushed open the door, the small bell above it tinkling nervously. The street fell silent. The laughter from the saloon porch died instantly. Troy Kingsley's head swiveled, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. The Apache warrior froze his hand, half raised. He watched her approach, his dark eyes, wary, suspicious, but too weak to hide the flicker of desperate hope. He was young, she realized, perhaps no older than 20. "Here," she said softly, holding out the bread and water. "Take it." He did not move. His gaze flickered from her face to the bread, then over her shoulder to Troy Kingsley, who was now slowly rising from his chair. "Go on," she urged gently. "Nadi Biati, peace." It was one of the few phrases a friendly prospector had taught her a simple offering. That seemed to break the spell. With a slow, almost reverent movement, the warrior took the loaf from her. His fingers were hot and dry. He then took the canteen, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't gorge himself. He broke off a small piece of bread, chewed it with a slow, agonizing deliberation, and took a sip of water. It was the act of a man clinging to his dignity in the face of utter degradation. Then the world exploded. "Well, well, well," boomed Troy Kingsley's voice, dripping with venomous glee. "What do we have here? Our sainted widow Helena Vaughan feeding a filthy redskin." He strode toward them, Cletus and Ike fanning out behind him like cowardly hyenas. The few townspeople who had been watching from their windows recoiled, but no one intervened. "Giving away good bread to a savage, are we?" Troy sneered, stopping a few feet from her. He looked the Apache up and down with utter contempt. "Look at it. Barely a man. Probably got the pox. And you're feeding him from your own hand." Helena stood her ground, her chin held high. "He was starving, Mr. Kingsley. It is a Christian duty to feed the hungry." Troy laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Christian duty, you hear that, boys? She thinks this animal has a soul." He took another step, his shadow falling over her. "I think you just got a soft spot for his kind. Helena, an Indian lover right here in Salvation's Point." The insult hung in the hot, still air, as vile as a corpse. Helena's face paled, but her eyes flashed with anger. "You are a godless man, Troy. And you're a fool," he spat. With a sudden vicious movement, he slapped the half-eaten loaf from the Apache's hand. It landed in the thick dust of the street. He eats dirt. That's what his kind understands. The Apache warrior flinched not from the blow, but as if a sacred right had been violated. He looked at the bread in the dust, then his eyes blazing now with a fire that seemed impossible in his emaciated state lifted to meet Troy's. There was no fear in them. There was only a cold, bottomless hatred. Troy, emboldened by the warrior's physical weakness, turned his attention back to Helena. He jabbed a thick finger into her shoulder. "You're a disgrace to this town. A disgrace to your husband's memory. You bring vermin to our streets and expect us to stomach it. From now on, your prices for water are halved for me and my boys. Consider it a tax for your poor judgment." He shoved her not hard enough to make her fall, but hard enough to make her stumble back a step. It was a violation, a public assertion of dominance. Sheriff Brody watched from the doorway of his office, his hand hovering near his pistol, but his feet were rooted to the spot. Fear of Troy Kingsley was a stronger law than any badge. Troy smirked, satisfied with her humiliation. "Let that be a lesson to you. Next time let the buzzards have him." He turned and swaggered back toward the saloon, his cronies chuckling behind him. Shaking with a mixture of rage and shame, Helena looked at the Apache. He was still staring at Troy Kingsley's back, his expression unreadable, a mask of Kingsley. Then his gaze shifted back to her. He looked at her, then at the bread in the dust, then back at her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of thanks. It was a nod of acknowledgement of seeing. He saw her act of kindness, and he saw her public shaming. He saw it all. Without another look at the bread, he turned and walked away. Not with the shuffle of a starving beggar, but with a new-found straightness in his spine. He disappeared back into the shimmering heat from which he came, leaving Helena alone in the silent street, the dust settling on the proof of her transgression. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was not the end. She had defied the wolf of Salvation's Point, and now she was marked. The days following the incident curdled. The air in Salvation's Point grew thick with unspoken judgment. When Helena walked down the street, conversations would cease, replaced by whispers that followed her like flies. The women of the town, who had once offered polite if distant greetings, now clutched their children's hands and crossed the street to avoid her. She was tainted. The label Troy Kingsley had hurled at her Indian lover had stuck. Business at Vaughan's Provisions dwindled to a trickle. Prospectors and ranchers, who had once relied on her for supplies, now made the longer trip to the next town or bought overpriced goods from the saloon. Troy Kingsley had made it clear that doing business with Helena Vaughan was a good way to get on his bad side, and few were brave or foolish enough to test him. The only person who still treated her with a semblance of decency was Silas, the stooped elderly man who ran the livery stable. He would still buy his bread from her, always slipping a few extra coins into her hand, and muttering, "For your trouble, ma'am. Don't let that blowhard grind you down." His kindness was a small candle in a vast darkness. Troy Kingsley, for his part, revelled in his power. He and his men took to lounging on the bench opposite her store, making loud, lewd comments whenever she stepped outside. They never laid a hand on her, but their presence was a constant, suffocating pressure. True to his word, he demanded his water at half price, often sending Ike or Cletus with a dozen barrels at a time, taking far more than they needed, wasting it, just to prove they could. Every time she worked the handle of the well pump for them, she felt a piece of her resolve chip away. One evening, as twilight painted the desert in shades of bruised purple and orange, Troy approached her as she was locking up. "Evening, Helena," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality. "Mr. Kingsley," she replied, not looking at him, her focus on the heavy bolt of the door. "Still stubborn, I see. This town's turning its back on you. You can't last much longer. Your shelves are getting bare." It was true. Without regular business, she couldn't afford to restock from the freight wagons that passed through every month. "I'm managing," she said, her voice tight. "Are you—" He stepped closer, his bulk blocking the last of the light. He smelled of whiskey and sweat. "I'm a patient man, but my patience is wearing thin. I'll make you one last offer for this place. $500. For the store, the well, everything." It was a laughable sum. The well alone was worth 5 times that. "The answer is the same as it always was. No." His friendly mask dropped. "You think you're better than me, don't you, Saint Helena, handing out bread to savages while the rest of us are trying to build a civilization out here?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Your husband, Thomas, he was a fool too, an idealist. He didn't understand how this world works." The mention of Thomas was a knife twist. "Leave my husband out of this." "Oh, I can't." Troy chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Because you're making the same damn mistakes he did. He had his head in the clouds, thought he could befriend anyone, thought this land would just give itself to him. Look where it got him. A pine box." Something in his tone, a note of personal venom, sent a shiver down Helena's spine. The official story was that Thomas had caught a fever while prospecting in the hills. He'd come back delirious and died within 2 days. But Troy spoke of it with a familiarity, a contempt that felt wrong. "You should take my offer, Helena," he said, his hand resting on the doorframe next to her head, trapping her. "It would be healthier for you. A woman alone out here. Accidents happen. Fevers come on quick." The threat was no longer veiled. It was as plain as the pockmarks on his face. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Kingsley?" He smiled. "I'm giving you sound financial advice. Sell to me, take the money, and get on the next stagecoach east. Go back to wherever you came from, where people have time for Christian duty." She ducked under his arm and faced him, her back now to her own door. "This is my home. You will not frighten me away from it." His eyes hardened into chips of obsidian. "Then you're a bigger fool than he was." He turned and walked away, leaving her trembling not with fear, but with a cold, terrifying certainty. He had something to do with Thomas's death. She couldn't prove it, couldn't even articulate why she felt it, but she knew it in her bones. The fever wasn't just a random act of fate. It was an accident Troy had spoken of. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Helena lay awake, the sounds of the desert night pressing in on her. She thought of Thomas, of his optimism, his belief in the good of people. He had been prospecting in the canyons north of town when he'd supposedly fallen ill. He'd been so excited before he left, talking about a new seam, he'd found something that would set them up for life. He'd returned a broken man, muttering about theft and vultures in his delirium before the fever silenced him for good. At the time, she'd thought it was just the fever talking. Now Troy's words echoed in her mind. He didn't understand how this world works. Driven by a desperate need to do something, anything, she rose from her bed. Lighting a single lamp, she went to the old chest where she kept Thomas's belongings. She sifted through his worn clothes, his books, and his geological maps. Tucked into the back of his journal, she found a folded, dirt-stained piece of paper she'd never seen before. It was a crude map, a sketch of the very canyons he'd been exploring. But in the center, he had drawn her well, and from it, an underground line snaking its way north directly into the heart of the canyon he had marked with a large X. Beside it, he had scrawled a few words: Source. Year-round spring. Feeds the town well. Must register the claim before Kingsley finds out. The breath left her body. It wasn't just her well that was valuable. It was the source of the water, an underground spring on land that was as yet unclaimed. That was what Thomas had found. That was the secret that would set them up for life. And Troy Kingsley, whose own ranch was notoriously dry, whose cattle were thin and bony, must have found out. He hadn't just wanted her small plot of land in town. He wanted the water that lay hidden beneath the barren hills, the lifeblood of the entire region. And he had killed her husband for it. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Troy wasn't just a bully and a racist. He was a murderer. And he was playing a long game. He hadn't taken the land by force because an open land grab would draw the attention of the territorial marshals. But if he could acquire Thomas's property legally by intimidating his widow into selling, he would control the only existing access point to the water, the well, right outside her door. The map was proof of Thomas's discovery, and by extension, proof of Troy's motive. She clutched the paper to her chest, her knuckles white. She was no longer just a victim of harassment. She was the sole obstacle standing between a killer and his prize. And he knew that sooner or later, she would have to break. The squeeze was no longer just about intimidation. It was about her life. Autumn bled into the landscape, chasing away the oppressive heat and painting the scrubland in muted tones of gold and brown. The nights grew cold, and a sharp wind whispered through the cracks in Helena's small home, a constant reminder of her isolation. Troy Kingsley's pressure was relentless. He'd dammed the small creek that ran past the edge of town, diverting the trickle of water to his own ranch, and making Helena's well the only source of potable water for miles. He now charged the townspeople an exorbitant price for every bucket, while still taking his own for free. He was strangling Salvation's Point and using Helena as the garrote. They blamed her. She saw it in their hollow eyes as they paid Kingsley's men for the water from her well. They saw her as the cause of their hardship, the stubborn woman whose pride was costing them dearly. She was utterly alone, a pariah in the town she had tried to call home. Thomas's map was a constant, terrifying secret. She kept it hidden, knowing it was the only proof of Troy's crime, but it was a weapon she had no idea how to wield. Who would believe her over the powerful Troy Kingsley Sheriff Brody would sooner arrest her for slander. One afternoon, as a storm brooded on the horizon, Troy made his move. He strode to her store with Sheriff Brody in tow. Brody wouldn't meet her eyes. "Helena," Troy began, his voice devoid of any pretense of friendliness. "The town council," he gestured to himself and two of his paid-off cronies standing nearby, "has voted your refusal to sell your property, and the well constitutes a public nuisance. It's causing undue hardship. We have a writ here, signed by the sheriff, ordering you to sell your property to the township for the previously offered sum of $500, for the public good." It was a perversion of the law, a theft dressed up in legal paper. She looked at Sheriff Brody, her eyes pleading. "Sheriff, you know this is wrong. He's stealing my land." Brody shuffled his feet, his face a mask of shame. "My hands are tied, Mrs. Vaughn. It's for the good of the town. We need that water managed properly." "Managed by him," She shot back, her voice shaking with rage. "This is my home. My husband built this place. Your husband is dead," Troy said coldly. "And this place, it is about to have a new owner. You have 24 hours to collect your personal belongings and vacate. If you refuse, the sheriff will remove you by force." Tears of helpless fury welled in her eyes. This was it. The end of the line. He had won. She had nothing left to fight with. The town was against her. The law was bought and paid for, and the man who murdered her husband was about to stand over his grave as a victor. She stood there defeated as they tacked the notice to her door. The world seemed to shrink down to that single piece of paper, a testament to her failure. The next day dawned grey and cold. The storm had broken in the night, washing the dust from the air, but leaving a damp chill that seeped into the bones. Helena moved through her home like a ghost packing a small bag, with her few personal treasures, a photograph of her and Thomas, his journal, and the terrible map. She had nowhere to go, no money, no future. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered. They watched from a distance, a silent chorus of witnesses to her final humiliation. Troy Kingsley stood on the saloon porch, a cigar jutting from his sneer, flanked by his men. He was savoring his victory. Suddenly, a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the town. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire ridge was lined with them, perhaps 20 riders in all, sitting motionless on their horses, their forms stark against the grey sky. They were not soldiers or cowboys. They were Apache. They were armed for war with rifles across their laps and painted faces that were grim and resolute. A gasp went through the crowd. The townspeople scurried for cover, their morbid curiosity replaced by stark terror. Troy Kingsley's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "What in hell is this?" he muttered. At the center of the line of warriors, one figure urged his horse forward and began the slow descent into town. He was not the emaciated boy Helena had fed. This was a man in his prime, broad-shouldered and powerful. He wore beaded leather leggings and a warrior's vest. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. His face was set like granite, and his eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the town until they found her standing alone in front of her store. It was him, Taza. He rode into the center of the street and stopped his horse, a magnificent pinto that seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. His warriors remained on the ridge, a silent, deadly promise. Troy Kingsley, bolstered by the rifle in his hands, and his men beside him, stepped forward. "This is a white man's town. Apache, you're not welcome here. State your business and be gone." Taza ignored him completely. His gaze was locked on Helena. He dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful 10 feet away. The entire town held its breath. He spoke, his voice clear and strong, carrying in the tense silence. He did not speak in the broken English she had heard from others. He spoke in his own tongue, a rhythmic, powerful cadence. But one of his warriors who had ridden down with him began to translate, his English heavily accented, but understandable. "He is Taza of the Chiricahua," the translator announced. "He says he has come to honor a debt." Taza's eyes, fixed on Helena, softened for a fraction of a second. He spoke again. "He says a warrior's spirit is not only found in battle." The translator continued. "It is found in courage when you are surrounded by enemies. It is found in kindness when all others show cruelty. He says you showed him the spirit of a warrior when you gave him bread and water even when your own tribe turned on you." Helena stared, mesmerized and terrified. This couldn't be happening. Troy Kingsley, his voice trembling with rage, raised his rifle. "I don't give a damn what he says. Get out of my town." Taza did not even flinch. He spoke a single, sharp phrase in Apache. The translator's voice cut through the air. "He says you are a coyote who preys on the wounded. You have no honor. You are a man who eats the dirt." He used the very insult Troy had thrown at him. Troy's face turned purple with rage. Then Taza turned his full attention back to Helena. He took a step closer. He spoke again, his voice lower, more personal this time. The translator hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "He says that such a spirit must not be left to the coyotes. Such courage must be honored. He says his people have lost here to many women, to the soldiers, to the sickness. They need strength. They need spirit." Taza took one more step forward, his gaze intense, unwavering. He spoke the final words himself in slow, deliberate English, the words he must have practiced for months. "Helena Vaughan," he said, his voice resonating with a power that shook her to her core. "I have not come for revenge. I have come for you. I claim you as my bride." A collective gasp, a sound of pure shock rippled through the onlookers. Troy Kingsley looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Helena felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. It wasn't a proposal. It was a declaration, a statement of fact. In front of the man who had stolen her home, in front of the town that had shunned her, this warrior had returned. Not to burn the town, not to kill the man who had wronged him, but to claim her, to elevate her, to offer her a protection so absolute and terrifying that no one dared to challenge it. He was repaying his debt of honor in the only way his culture understood, by binding her fate to his. The silence that followed Taza's declaration was so profound that the whistle of the wind sounded like a scream. Helena stood frozen, caught in the crossfire of two worlds she wanted no part of. A bride to a man she didn't know, from a people she'd been taught to fear. It was impossible. Yet as she looked into Taza's unyielding eyes, she saw no lust, no greed, like she saw in Troy's. She saw a strange, fierce respect. He was offering her an escape, a shield, but the price was her entire world. Troy Kingsley was the first to recover his shock, curdling into pure, sputtering rage. The idea that this savage would dare to lay claim to something he considered his was an affront to his very existence. "His bride!" Troy bellowed, his voice cracking. "You'll be no such thing. She's a white woman. She belongs here." He gestured wildly around the miserable, dusty town. "This is her place. This is the place that casts her out," Taza replied in his steady English, his gaze not leaving Helena. "This is the man who would leave her with nothing." "She is nothing without this place," Troy shrieked, losing all composure. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful landowner crumbled, revealing the desperate, cornered killer beneath. He knew that if Helena left with the Apache, his claim to the land, the well, and its precious source would be contested perhaps forever. Taza's presence threatened to undo everything he had killed for. He had to end this. He had to turn the town, what little of it was watching, back to his side. He had to destroy Helena's credibility completely. "You people don't know the truth about this woman," Troy yelled to the terrified faces peering from windows and doorways. "You think she's some poor widow. You think her husband just up and died of a fever." A cold dread washed over Helena. She knew what was coming. "No!" Troy roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. Her husband, Thomas Vaughan, was a thief. He found a spring up in the hills. Water that belongs to this whole territory. And he was going to claim it all for himself, leaving the rest of us to rot in the dust. He was twisting the truth, painting Thomas as the villain. I tried to reason with him. Troy lied, his voice thick with false righteousness. I offered to partner with him to share the water with the town. But he was greedy. He pulled a gun on me. It was him or me. I defended myself, that's all. It was a fair fight. He paused, letting the confession wrapped in a lie sink in. I didn't say anything to spare her the shame of having a thief for a husband. I was protecting her. And what does she do? She turns around and gives aid to our enemies. He spat on the ground. She has no loyalty, not to her husband's memory, not to this town, not to her own kind. The revelation, though warped, hung in the air. Troy had admitted to killing Thomas. The town was silent, processing the news. Sheriff Brody looked pale, his hand twitching near his gun, but he was paralyzed by the chaos. Troy's eyes, wild and frantic, found Helena's. "So you see," he sneered, "you have no one. No one wants you. Your only choice is to sign that deed and pray I let you walk away." It was a masterfully cruel stroke. He had confessed to the murder, but framed it as self-defense, simultaneously destroying Thomas's reputation and justifying his own actions. He had painted Helena as the consort of a thief and a traitor. But Troy Kingsley had made one fatal miscalculation. He thought shame and fear were the only things Helena possessed. He was wrong. In that moment, hearing the man who murdered her husband slander his name, something inside Helena snapped. The fear, the loneliness, the crushing weight of the past year coalesced into a single point of pure, cold fury. She wasn't a prize to be won. She wasn't a victim to be pitied. She was Thomas Vaughan's wife, and she would not let this stand. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her back on Taza and faced Troy Kingsley. The crowd murmured, thinking she was capitulating. Troy's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. "I knew you'd see reason," he began. He never finished the sentence. With a movement so swift it blurred. Helena lifted the hem of her heavy skirt, revealing the worn leather holster strapped to her thigh. From it, she drew a Colt Peacemaker, the very gun her father had taught her to use before she'd ever learned to bake bread. It was a skill she had kept hidden, a relic of a past life she had tried to leave behind. She cocked the hammer, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The pistol was rock steady in her hand, aimed directly at Troy Kingsley's black heart. "My husband," she said, her voice no longer trembling, but ringing with icy clarity, "was the best man I have ever known. He wanted to share that water, but he knew you would steal it, just like you steal everything you touch." She took a step forward, the gun never wavering. "You didn't kill him in a fair fight. You ambushed him. You shot him in the back and left him to die, didn't you? But he was stronger than you thought. He made it home. He just couldn't tell me who did it before the fever took hold." Her eyes bored into his. "But I have his journal, and his map. The map to the spring you killed him for." The color drained from Troy's face. The map, the proof. He had assumed it was lost, that Thomas had died with the secret. "You're a liar," he stammered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. From behind her, Helena heard Taza speak a single soft word in his language. The translator's voice followed, filled with a note of awe. "He says, 'The spirit of the warrior is true.'" Helena now stood between the two forces that had been vying for her. But she was not in the middle. She was her own force. She was no longer Helena Vaughan, the grieving widow. She was Helena Vaughan, the avenger. "You will not have my home," she said, her voice dangerously low. "You will not have his water, and you will not speak his name again." She took a deep breath. "Now, Troy, you're going to tell the sheriff exactly what you did, or so help me God, I will send you to hell myself." The standoff was absolute. The outlaw, the warrior, and the widow with the gun. And for the first time in a year, the fate of Salvation's Point was not in the hands of the man with the most power, but in the hands of the woman who had finally decided to take it back. The world had shrunk to the space between Helena's unwavering eye and the front of Troy Kingsley's sweat-stained shirt. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on Salvation's Point, so heavy that the whistle of the wind through the saloon's rafters sounded like a mournful sigh. Helena could feel the heft of the Colt peacemaker in her hand, a solid, deadly extension of her will. It did not tremble. Troy Kingsley, however, did. He stared down the dark, unblinking bore of the pistol, and in its shadow his entire empire of fear crumbled into dust. His face, moments before a mask of triumphant rage, had dissolved into a slack-jawed puddle of disbelief. This was not how the story was supposed to end. Widows were meant to weep. The weak were meant to break. He saw the cold fury in Helena's eyes, a fury he had ignited, and for the first time he understood he was not facing a victim, but a reckoning. "She's bluffing," he croaked the words, meant to rally his men, to reassure himself. But his voice was thin, a reedy whisper, swallowed by the immense silence. His animal instincts screamed at him to act, to regain control. His world was tilting off its axis, and his only thought was to set it right through the familiar language of violence. With a desperate spastic motion, he began to lift his rifle. He was a fraction of a second too slow. A deafening roar shattered the stillness, a blast so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. It did not come from Helena's Colt. From the deep shadows of the livery stable, a cloud of grey smoke billowed forth. The rifle in Troy's hands exploded into a spray of splintered wood, and twisted metal ripped from his grasp as if by an invisible hand. He shrieked a high, pathetic sound, stumbling back and clutching his right hand, where angry red welts were already rising. Every head swiveled. Standing in the livery doorway, framed by harnesses and the smell of hay, was Silas. The old, stooped stableman, a man most townsfolk barely noticed, stood tall, a long-barreled shotgun resting easy in his arms. The spent cartridge ejected onto the dusty floor with a soft metallic clink. His face, usually a road map of gentle wrinkles, was set like flint. "He ain't bluffing, Troy." Silas called out his voice, a low, gravelly rasp that carried an authority no one knew he possessed. "And neither am I." He took a deliberate step forward into the light. A man can only swallow so much poison before he chokes on it. I heard you that night in the saloon after Thomas Vaughan died. Heard you bragging to your boys about how you settled a claim out in the hills, how the widow would be easy pickings once her spirit was broken. Silas's gaze swept over the stunned townspeople. I held my tongue then out of fear, and I've been tasting the shame of it every day since. No more. He leveled the shotgun's remaining barrel at Troy's chest. Now you drop that gun belt, slowly. The old man's courage was a spark in a tinderbox. Sheriff Brody, who had been frozen in a purgatory of fear and duty, was shocked into motion. The sight of Silas, a man with far less authority and far more to lose standing up to Kingsley, was the final humiliation his conscience could bear. A dark flush rose on his neck, and he drew his own pistol, the shame on his face hardening into a brittle resolve. "He's right, Kingsley." Brody's voice was shaky at first, but gained strength with each word. "It's over. You, Cletus, Ike, unbuckle them. Now." The shift in power was palpable, a physical change in the atmosphere. Cletus and Ike exchanged a panicked glance. Their loyalty was to Troy's money, and the power it brought them, not to the man himself. They were paid predators, and the hunt had just turned on them. Cletus's hand twitched a reflexive motion toward his holster, but his eyes darted up to the ridge. The line of Apache warriors sat unmoving, their silence more menacing than any war cry. They were witnesses, judges. They hadn't interfered, but their presence guaranteed there would be no escape. The odds had become impossibly long. With a shared look of grim resignation, Cletus and Ike slowly, clumsily unbuckled their gun belts, letting them fall to the ground with a soft thud. The power that had strangled Salvation's Point was broken, but the final judgment belonged to Helena. She walked forward, her boots making no sound in the thick dust. The world seemed to fade to a blur around her, the faces of the town, the grim line of warriors, the newly brave sheriff. All of it receded until only she and the man before her remained. Troy scrambled backward on the ground, his eyes wide and pleading as she approached. The tyrant was gone, replaced by a sniveling coward. "Helena, Mrs. Vaughan." "Wait," he stammered, holding up his uninjured hand as if to ward her off. "We can make a deal. The well, the land. It's yours, I'll sign it over. Just don't." She stopped, standing over him. The heat of vengeance was a living coal in her chest. She thought of Thomas, his laughter, his dreams of building a life here. She thought of the lonely, terrifying year she had endured, the whispers, the leers, the constant grinding pressure of Troy's presence. She could end him. Right here. A single twitch of her finger was all it would take. Justice would be served. His blood would wash away the stain of her humiliation. But as she looked down at the pathetic man scrabbling in the dirt, she realized that killing him would not be an act of justice. It would be an act of rage, and it would bind her to him forever. His violence would become the defining moment of her life. Pulling the trigger would mean he had finally succeeded in breaking her in, turning her into a killer like him. And Thomas, the kind, hopeful man she had loved, would not have wanted that. "My husband was a better man than you," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the finality of a death sentence. "And you're not worth the bullet that would send you to him." The fire of vengeance within her did not die. It cooled, hardening into something stronger, something more pure. It hardened into peace. With a movement that was both fluid and brutally efficient, she reversed the pistol in her hand. The heavy steel barrel flashed in the grey light. She brought the butt of the Colt down in a swift, sharp arc against the side of Troy's head. There was a dull thud, and he crumpled without a sound, his reign over Salvation's Point, ending in a cloud of dust and unconsciousness. She stood over his fallen form, the gun hanging at her side, the immense tension of the last year finally draining from her body. It was done. The town, released from its spell, surged forward. Men who had cowered behind their doors now found their courage helping Sheriff Brody clap irons on Cletus and Ike and haul Troy's limp body toward the jail. They gave Helena a wide berth, their faces a complex mixture of awe, guilt, and fear. She was no longer just the widow Vaughan. She was something they didn't have a name for. When the street had cleared, only Taza and his translator remained. He dismounted and approached her, his moccasins silent on the earth. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in the pistol still clutched in her hand, the dusting of another man's blood on her knuckles, and the profound, weary calm that had settled on her face. He spoke, his voice a low murmur. "He says the debt is paid." The translator offered his own voice, tinged with reverence. "You have cleansed this place of the coyote. You have honored the memory of your mate." Helena finally let herself meet Taza's eyes. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound she felt she might collapse. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "for returning, for giving me the chance to—" She couldn't find the words for the transformation she had just undergone. Taza simply nodded his understanding, seeming to go deeper than words. He glanced around at the town, at the shuttered windows that were just beginning to open again, at the faces that watched them from a distance. He asks what now? The translator continued. The coyotes are caged, but their pups and their poison remain. This town's heart is weak. They will fear you now, but they will not love you. They will never understand you. This is not a home for a warrior's spirit. Taza took a step closer, speaking directly to her in his carefully practiced English. "My offer is still true. Helena Vaughan, not as a debt, as a choice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "In my camp you will not be the widow, the outcast, the strange one. You will be seen. You will be honored for the spirit inside you. You will be Ihe Ande, a sacred woman. You will be safe. You will belong." The choice laid bare. She looked at her store, the building she had fought and bled for. It was just wood and nails, filled with the ghosts of a life that no longer existed. She looked down the street toward the jail where her tormentor was caged, and felt no triumph, only emptiness. She looked toward the small hill where Thomas was buried. Her love for him was a part of her soul, a memory to be cherished, but her life among the graves was over. Finally, her gaze returned to Taza. In his steady, quiet eyes, she saw not the promise of an easy life, but the promise of an authentic one. It would be a world of hardship and challenges she couldn't yet imagine, but it would be a life where her courage was not an anomaly to be feared, but a quality to be revered. It was a life where she would not have to hide or shrink herself to fit. A small, weary but genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in a year. It felt like a sunrise. "I have some things to pack," she said. An hour later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Helena Vaughan emerged from her store for the last time. She carried only a small satchel. The town watched in silence as Taza brought forward a steady-looking mare for her. She swung into the saddle with a practiced ease that surprised them all one last time. She rode out of Salvation's Point, not looking back. Beside her rode the Apache warrior, who had recognized her soul when she had nearly forgotten it herself. Together they rode toward the ridge, where his warriors waited, two solitary figures against the vast, bleeding sky. She was not a captive, not a prize, not a bride in any way the town could comprehend. She was a partner, an equal riding toward an unknown horizon, leaving the ghosts of her past to be swallowed by the dust. And so Helena Vaughan's story in Salvation's Point came to an end, not with a whimper, but with the thunder of hooves riding toward a new dawn. Her tale became a legend in the territory, a story whispered around campfires about the quiet widow who harbored the spirit of a warrior. It serves as a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the power you hold over others, but the courage you find within yourself. And that sometimes the most unexpected acts of kindness can change your destiny forever. What do you think of Helena's choice? Would you have stayed, or would you have ridden with Tarza? Let us know in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of frontier justice and unexpected love, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good Western, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed heart of the Old West. Thanks for listening.